Good evening again, and welcome to the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy's 2021 Tansley Lecture. My name is Parvinya Zamparas, and I am an MPA candidate with Johnson Shoyama and an executive intern with Financial and Consumer Affairs Authority of Saskatchewan. I will also be your MC for tonight's event. I would like to acknowledge that while the Tansley Lecture is taking place online this year, Johnson Shoyama's physical homes at the University of Regina and University of Saskatchewan are located on Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 lands and the traditional homeland of the Métis. We pay our respect to our First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. We would also like to welcome those of you joining us from across Turtle Island. I am very much looking forward to tonight's discussion on this timely topic during the pandemic, and considering that the budget is out and as governments plan for the economic recovery and managing deficits, I'm certain this will be a thought-provoking presentation and discussion for all, and a special learning opportunity for students. Now, before we hear a few remarks from our Executive Director, Dr. Lolene Berdahl, I would like to take care of a few housekeeping items. We kindly ask that all attendees stay muted and turn off your video during the presentation portion of our event. Feel free to turn your videos back on for the Q&A. The format for tonight's event is as follows. Following the opening remarks, our speaker, Dr. Stephanie Kelton, will present for approximately 15 minutes, followed by a fireside discussion with Dr. Marc-André Pigeon, JSGS Assistant Professor and Director of the Canadian Centre for the Study of Cooperatives. For the remaining time, Dr. Kelton will entertain audience questions moderated by Dr. Pigeon. If you would like to ask a question, please use Zoom's chat function to submit your questions. Because we have a large audience and a short amount of time, I would encourage you to keep your questions concise and to the point so that our speaker can respond to as many questions as possible. If you have any logistical issues during tonight's presentation, please don't hesitate to send a message to Karen Jester Lawforge via Zoom's chat function or email the school at jsgs.events@uregina.ca. I am now pleased to introduce JSGS Executive Director, Dr. Lolene Berdahl, who will say a few words on behalf of the school. Dr. Berdahl.
Thank you, Parvin, and thank you everyone for being here. It's so exciting to have so many people joining us from across the country and beyond. And I'd like to take just a few minutes to say a few words about our school. Founded in 2007 by the University of Regina and the University of Saskatchewan, the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy is well known and respected for its innovative graduate degree and micro-credential programs, executive education training opportunities, and research excellence. Like the rest of the world, this past year has been one to remember. In March 2020, our school pivoted to online learning and training for all students in order to meet the challenges presented by the COVID-19 pandemic. However, when faced with the trials of operating in a virtual world, we also looked for opportunities. Our faculty, executives and residents, and staff worked collaboratively across our two universities to support students. Our executive education team took its training online to continue supporting public servants and communities throughout the province. And our researchers looked for opportunities to secure national and provincial grants that focused on pandemic-related research, among other areas. Just last week, our own Dr. Cheryl Camillo was named a Koch applicant on a $9 million grant to establish a national COVID variant rapid response network. The week prior, Dr. Tarun Katapalli was awarded more than $500,000 to expand his Co-Away platform beyond COVID-19 to address a broad range of health issues, such as mental health, substance misuse, and domestic violence, as well as addressing communicable and non-communicable disease in Northern Indigenous communities. Not to mention faculty members Dr. Justin Longo, Dr. Murray Fulton, Dr. Marc-André Pigeon, and Dr. Yang Yang received $60,000 to examine the latest impacts of digital technologies on public and agricultural sectors. Lastly, through virtual events like the Tansley Lecture, we have been able to continue bringing together thought leaders, academics, students, public servants, and community members from across Canada and around the globe to listen and learn about current issues affecting Canadians. Speaking of thought leaders, the late Donald Tansley was known and respected for his remarkable career as a senior public servant in Canada. An alumnus of the University of Saskatchewan, he began his career in the government of Saskatchewan in the Budget Bureau under the guidance of Al Johnson. Donald was known for leading some of the most complex and contentious files in provincial government, from rescuing IPSCO from bankruptcy to implementing Medicare in Saskatchewan to leading the modernization of the provincial government in New Brunswick and implementing highly controversial policies such as the Program of Equal Opportunity. In 1968, he moved to the Federal Public Service, where he served as Vice President of the Canadian International Development Agency, advisor to the Red Cross, CEO of the controversial Anti-Inflation Board, and finally, he led the development of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Donald Tansley's character and commitment to the public service were undeniable. Often you would hear him encouraging colleagues to persevere through challenges and to take harsh judgments with a grain of salt. Two pieces of advice I think would still resonate with our students today. Now that is enough from me. I'm sure you would rather hear from our keynote speaker. So I would like to invite Dr. Marc-André Pigeon to introduce our guest of honor. Marc-André.
Great. Thank you so much, Lolene. So Dr. Stephanie Kelton, I'm going to refer to her as Stephanie because we've known each other for going on 25 years now, is a leading authority on modern monetary theory, a sort of new, I guess you could say, approach to economics that has really captured the attention of the policymaking space. I'll refer a bit back to this in a few moments. She's also considered one of the most important voices influencing that debate today, and I think we'll hear echoes of that as well through our conversation. Her New York Times bestseller, The Deficit Myth, Modern Monetary Theory, and the Birth of the People's Economy, really kind of tries to get at this question of the flawed thinking that she argues, and I would agree, has kind of limited our policymakers around the world. So in addition to Stephanie's many academic publications, and I'll refer to those a little bit later as well, she's been a contributor to Bloomberg Opinion, has written for the Financial Times, the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, US News and World Report, CNN, and many others. Now, I mentioned Stephanie's kind of been in academia, and I'm going to come back to that in a minute, but it's also important to point out her practical engagement in the political space. She served as a chief economist on the US Senate Budget Committee Democratic staff in 2015, and as a senior economic advisor to Bernie Sanders' 2016 and 2020 presidential campaigns. She's also a senior fellow at the Schwartz Center for Economic Policy Analysis and a professor of economics and public policy at Stony Brook University. Stephanie has had visiting professorships at the New School for Social Research, the University of Ljubljana, and the University of Adelaide. She was previously the chair of the Department of Economics at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Now back to the kind of public engagement piece thing. Politico has called Stephanie in 2016 one of the 50 most influential thinkers. In 2019, Bloomberg listed her as one of the 50 people who defined that year. Barron's named her as one of the 100 most influential women in finance in 2020, and Prospect Magazine listed her among the world's top 50 thinkers in 2020. Now, I'll just add a little bit of a personal note to this. Stephanie is also a friend. We first met about 23 years ago. Our offices were just next to each other when we were both passing through the Levy Economics Institute, just a little bit north of New York City. And Stephanie and I were both drawn to this place to work with a fellow named Randy Ray, who's another leading figure in the MMT research community. And I'd add as well, the late, great Wynne Godley was one of the most influential economists in the United Kingdom for decades, and whose work has exerted influence on the development of MMT, but also is really finding its way into central banks and Department of Finance, including our own Federal Department of Finance. And that work has a nice linkage to MMT. I'd also add that late 1990s period was a really kind of a special time in the history of ideas, because in many ways, it was the kind of pinnacle of the Washington consensus, what I'd call the Washington consensus. Some people might say the neoliberal suite of policy ideas. And that included, of course, liberalized trade, privatization of state assets. And at the heart of that consensus, this notion of balanced budgets. And I think that idea was really especially anchored in Canada. And we're going to come back to that when Stephanie and I engage in a conversation. But it was also equally true in the United States, Australia, many other places. That was the anchor that kind of held all this kind of suite of policies together. And what was interesting was that the Levy Institute in the late 90s, not only was MMT being developed as a kind of research stream or thread, but there was a lot of exciting research on wealth and income inequality, and minimum wages, a whole lot of issues that right now are kind of really in the fore. So it was an exciting time, and I feel very fortunate to have been passing through at that time. So then with that, I kind of want to just set that up, because we're going to come back to this trajectory of these ideas that were on the margin 20, 25 years ago, but are now at the center of the policy discussion. And how did that happen? So with that, I'd like to ask you to please join me in welcoming Stephanie Kelton as our 13th annual Tansley speaker. I think this is a really opportune. I didn't realize that the Mr. Tansley was involved in Inflation Board. I think this is a nice tie into our conversation today. So with that, Stephanie, I'm going to pass it over to you, say a few marks, and then we'll engage in a conversation.
Thank you, Marc-Andre, and to all of you who put forward this invitation and helped with the arrangements. I'm delighted to be able to spend a bit of time with you this evening. And I know that our time is limited, and I do think that in many ways, the most enjoyable part of this, probably for me and all of you, is going to come in the second portion when we actually just get to have some dialogue. So I don't want to take a tremendous amount of time, but I do want to sort of lay out a sort of broad brushstroke of what modern monetary theory, or MMT, is. And in some ways that's a challenge, right? Because as Marc-Andre said, this is a label, MMT, that is applied to a body of scholarship that has been developed now over a quarter of a century, and by a number of economists, and increasingly others from outside of economics, legal scholars, some historians and humanists and others. So the body of work has grown, and it's impossible to wrap your arms around it, especially in a 10 or so minute kind of opening remarks. But let me just start by telling you how I kind of came to this myself, because this is a journey for me, right? I was studying economics. I had a very conventional sort of training in economics. Many of my macro courses and money and banking, finance type courses were very conventional. And I began graduate school at Cambridge University in 1995 in the fall. And that is wrong, in 1996 in the fall. And that happened to be a time when, countries were beginning to think about joining this economic and monetary union, right? You had the Maastricht Treaty, this blueprint for introducing a common currency throughout parts of Europe. I was in the UK studying, and at that time, the British government was saying, we don't think we're going to go in with you in this first phase. We're going to let the rest of you go forward. We'll sit back, see how it goes. And if it looks like things are working out all right, maybe we'll join you later. And I remember that being such a big part of the conversation in not just, at Cambridge where I was studying and within economics, but the politics, right? There was so much talk about this. And I guess for me, I started to then realize that there was something really big about this looming decision about whether to give up your currency and switch to using a different currency. And in some ways, a lot of the people around me were basically saying, what difference does it make? Right? It's going to be more efficient. These are our main trading partners. And so if we move to this common currency, well, it's mostly going to be beneficial because we're going to reduce a lot of transaction costs, and we'll all be, trading in the same currency. And we'll have one central bank who will run monetary policy for the whole of the group that joins in. And not much concern was paid, actually, to what it would mean for fiscal policy. And Marc-Andre, you mentioned Wynne Godley's name. And I had not met Win yet, but I would meet Win just about a year later. I got a fellowship from Cambridge University to go to the Levy Institute. And Win Godley was at Levy, and Win had been the head of the Department of Applied Economics at Cambridge University. So that's where he came from, his academic home. But then he went to the US, and he was a very, very interesting man, extremely smart, had very different ways of looking at things, right? His analytical framework was unlike anything I had been introduced to before. And I started working with Win, and I started reading some of the things that Win had written about the euro, about the common currency. And here was this man who, as early as 1992, had laid out in the most incredibly clear fashion why it would be a mistake, in his view, for countries to move forward with this common currency project with the design that was in place. In other words, Win saw a design flaw, almost like a birth defect, in this document, in this Maastricht Treaty, which countries were signing on to and saying, if we go forward, we will all agree to these terms, right? We will be governed by one central bank. It will conduct monetary policy for all of us. We are all on our own when it comes to fiscal policy. We will run our own fiscal policy, and we will commit to playing by a certain set of rules. We will, in a sense, have fiscal discipline. We will not let our budget deficits rise in excess of 3% of GDP. We will keep our debt to GDP ratios under 60% of GDP. Now, some economists at the time were critical of those provisions. They said, I don't know if that's enough leeway, right? What if they need a little bit of extra room? Win saw things very differently. It wasn't that the thresholds were too restrictive. It was that the design itself was going to transform countries that were previously able to run fiscal policy, exercise fiscal policy in a way that would be most beneficial to their domestic economies, right? That they could maintain full employment, that they could look after the economy, manage the economy with using fiscal policy, that is government spending and tax policy, and that they would be giving up much more than just the ability to use monetary policy and have some constrained fiscal policy. Win saw a much bigger problem. So here I was thinking, well, something's interesting about this. The nature of the relationship between a nation and its currency, right? That when a government has the ability to issue its own currency, and when that government doesn't promise to convert that currency into something it could run out of, right? The government is not promising to convert to gold or to some other country's currency. But if you are a sovereign currency issuing government, issuing a non-convertible floating exchange rate fiat currency, that you have policy space available to you that countries that operate under more restrictive monetary systems do not have. And that was Win's real point, that he was saying, listen, don't go forward until you fix the design flaw. You're going to need fiscal policy. And as Marc-Andre said earlier, there was this sort of consensus in macroeconomics that really you don't need fiscal policy. All you need is a credible, independent central bank that it alone, right, has the tools necessary to manage the economy through the business cycle, that governments should mostly turn their attention to, getting their budgets in order, balancing budgets and preventing budgets from moving into deficit on any kind of sustained basis. And Win just saw things completely differently. He used something, I think he pioneered a framework called the sectoral financial balances framework. And in my book, I try to put forward what could otherwise get complicated using just a series of buckets. And I'm going to close with this little statement, okay? So I want you to imagine that you're interested in keeping your domestic economy healthy, right? You want lots of jobs, you want good economic conditions domestically, low inflation, high levels of employment. That's the bucket that you're worried about, your domestic private sector. So think of the Canadian economy, right? You have a government bucket, and the government bucket is important because the government bucket can, let's say, pour some dollars into the private sector to keep the private sector healthy. You got one more bucket. Okay, so we're dealing with three buckets. The other bucket is the rest of the world. And it's the interaction, the interplay between the financial balances, right? The flows between and among these buckets that Wynne thought were important. So if the goal is to keep the center bucket healthy, the private sector healthy, how can you do that? Well, there are different options. One option is that the rest of the world is providing very strong demand for the goods and services that come out of your economy. And that's producing lots of demand and supporting jobs, and you're getting good economic growth, but not too much pressure, and so not a lot of inflation. But if you don't have a trade surplus, if the rest of the world does not have a huge appetite for the things that you produce, then that bucket might actually be a drain on your economy. In our case, in the US, it certainly is, and in Canada's case, right? If you have trade deficits, or what are more appropriately called current account deficits, that foreign sector bucket is draining off some of your dollars, all right? So how do you compensate for that? Well, the government bucket can come in and replace some dollars that are being lost to the rest of the world. In other words, it's a little bit complicated to do kind of in a short, using my hands in my buckets. But the point is that the government's deficit is nothing more than the difference between the number of dollars that the government spends into the economy each year and the number of dollars it subtracts back out each year. So we are so accustomed to hearing the word deficit and having this averse reaction, right? A deficit, ooh, that's a bad thing, right? That's something you're supposed to try to avoid. No, no, no. Deficit is neither good nor bad. Surplus is neither good nor bad. What matters is the health of the economy. If you have a well-balanced economy, high levels of employment, low inflation, if your economy is balanced, the number that falls out of the budget box at the end of each year, whether it's a deficit or a surplus, is irrelevant. What matters is the budget helping you to balance the broader conditions in the economy. So every deficit is good for someone, right? If the government's budget is in deficit, it means they are spending more dollars into the economy than they are subtracting away, mostly through taxation. In other words, they're doing more adding than subtracting. And when they do that, somebody's on the receiving end, receiving that financial surplus. On the other side of every government deficit lies a financial surplus in some other part of the economy. The question is, for whom and for what, right? So we have governments, yours, mine, governments around the world that have been running sizable fiscal deficits in response to COVID and the ensuing economic fallout. Those deficits have produced enormous financial surpluses in the rest of the economy. That is support for the rest of the economy. Now, will those deficits need to remain large forever? No. The economy will recover. We will eventually beat COVID. And as we do, and as the economy begins to recover, the need for that fiscal support will diminish and the budget deficit can safely come down, right? I think so much of the debate now is beginning to turn to, should governments try to wrestle the deficit back down? Should they actively try to go in and cut spending or increase taxes in order to focus on rebalancing the budget outcome? And my position would always be that you never want to make the budget outcome the target of economic policy. The target of economic policy are real conditions in the economy. And again, if you can achieve a good economy with your budget like this, so be it, right? If you can achieve a good economy with your budget like this, so be it. That's not what is important. So there's so much more that we could do, but let's try to have a bit of conversation at this point.
For sure, Stephanie. And I think you know, just before we got on here, you said, let's have an organic conversation. So I'm gonna run with that. So you said a couple of things that really got my attention about the EU, for example, because interestingly, and this just came to my mind, in the late 90s, there was an active conversation about forming a North American monetary union, not so much in the United States, but in the Canadian space. This was the dominant topic when I was working at the Library of Parliament in the research division. And it just strikes me as really relevant also because Robert Mundell, who was at the kind of heart of this thinking, has just passed away.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if if you can reflect a little bit on that. Robert Mundell's passing, but he was a Canadian economist, had some profile globally, but he was really that kind of a key figure in a lot of this currency union thinking. So do you have any kind of thoughts that you can share about that, and maybe about Canada dodging the bullet in terms of not signing up for a North American Monetary Union?
Well, we all dodged a bullet. I mean, we would have all similarly situated ourselves in the place of a currency using government, right? I mean, that's the reality. When you look at what the decision in Europe was, and his work was extremely influential there. It was used to justify, it was sort of the theoretical justification for the introduction of the common currency in the Eurozone. And so, again, it comes back to this belief, this underlying faith in the power of monetary policy and in the lack of necessity really for fiscal. And so, yeah, you dodged a bullet, we dodged a bullet. I don't know that we ever came very close. I remember those conversations and that one beyond that, which is a world currency, a one world currency. Around the same time, people were saying, why stop there? We
Right.
could just have a one world currency sort of thing.
Let me pick up on that, Stephanie, because we've come a long way from those conversations, right? A lot of those conversations are dead in the water and they seem anachronistic. And so and MMT has kind of come in and filled a bit of a gap. How did that happen? How did MMT, in your view, go from the margins of the discussion to kind of really at the center of the discussion? I'll just, for the audience's sake, I'll flag a few things that happened just this week. Sorry, I'm blanking on his name now, but Goodhart, Charles Goodhart, a leading central bank theorist, I think you probably know a little bit, just the other day said everyone's doing MMT, they just don't like to admit it, okay? And maybe he's got the framing wrong, but it's still illustrative of how MMT has permeated the conversation. The C.D. Howe Institute here in Canada, probably our most high-profile think tank, certainly our most influential. I've taken these ideas seriously enough to come up with a policy brief last month and then an editorial this week where they actually concede some important points about MMT, but they warned about the siren song, right? And then Bloomberg not too long ago had a headline saying, promising to tell how MMT won the fiscal policy debate. So how did we get there? How did we move from this conversation that was very focused on budget balances, currency unions, privatization, trade agreements, to something that looks quite a bit different today?
Well, I think there are a lot of things that happened that have shifted the policy debate in, I will say, in our direction. I'm willing to say that because, look, again, 25 years, I say this all the time, the MMT scholarship has, the core of MMT has not changed. What we have said from the very beginning is still core central tenets of MMT. The idea that the government can't run out of money, the idea that as the issuer of the currency, the government must spend first, that taxes aren't necessary, that you can't, fiscal sustainability, all these debates that we were engaged in over the decades, we just continued to repeat the same thing over and over and over and over again. And what has happened is, and I think it's quite clear, is that so much of the macro discourse has just inched its way in our direction over time. Now you're asking, how did that happen? Well, to some extent, I think, getting a record in place and having the scholarship and just being able to demonstrate that you were thinking correctly about a lot of these things over time. And so being right matters in a sense, right? People begin to take notice. For us, early on, there were journalists who started to pay attention to our work. There was a journalist at Reuters, there was a journalist at Business Insider, and there was a journalist at the Wall Street Journal. 3 different guys, right? And they started looking at the stuff that we were writing, and they just were open-minded. And they started to think, well, they're saying things that are so different, that run so counter to the mainstream narratives in so many ways. But gosh, it's kind of interesting. And so they started to write about it and engage with us. And that gave us access to different and larger platforms to get our ideas out there. And then I think, they just started to in a sense, catch on, and people started to be more persuaded by the work that we were doing and sharing. And then you had the Great Recession, and you had deficits increase, and people sort of said, oh, well, I guess fiscal policy is important, but there was still that belief that it's the kind of thing that, you know, you keep on the wall behind the glass that says break in case of emergency, right? You're not supposed to be really relying on and integrating in a permanent sort of toolkit the use of fiscal policy. And now here we are with COVID. And so I'll just kind of close with this. After, in the US context, after the Republicans cut taxes in 2017, right? They had these massive tax cuts, and Democrats hated them. And many Democrats, including some very high profile ones, made the case very publicly that if the Republicans were successful in pushing through the tax cuts, that it was going to leave the US, I will use his words, living on a shoestring for decades to come because of the deficits, that is a quote, that we would be unable to respond with fiscal policy if the economy were to slow down. And I said, no, this can't be right. You know, the deficits of the past don't constrain your fiscal capacity in the future. So I penned a thing for Bloomberg and I said, this is not right. When the next downturn comes, we will use fiscal policy. And of course, the next downturn came, and what did we do? Multi-trillion-dollar legislation, one after another. We're spinning out bills. No pay-fors, no problems, no increase in taxes, no spike in, you know what I mean? So I think the answer is a complicated combination of factors, but that's kind of what I think got us to where we are.
Great, thanks, Stephanie. So I'm going to restrain myself from asking who you're referring to in terms of that public debate, but or if you feel comfortable, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I wrote about it, so it's Larry Summers.
Right.
Yeah, but Paul Krugman had a column and called it, deficits matter again, and was warning about the dangers of increasing the deficit with the tax cuts. And it was supposed to, in his piece, it was going to lead to crowding out as interest rates went up, and all this stuff just didn't happen.
Right. I think we've had very similar discourse, of course, in Canada, and probably many other places in the world. Now, I want to just kind of drill down on the Canadian story a little bit, because I think some of our audience members will certainly be thinking and asking themselves this question. So, I think you and I talked a bit about this, but there's this story that Canadians tell ourselves about our fiscal policy history. There was this golden era of the first post-war period, 1950s, 60s, where, maybe on balance, budgets were balanced over a cycle, that kind of thing. And our debt to GDP ratio kind of trended down. And then there was this kind of awful period in the 1980s where we ramped up the spending. Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the father of our current prime minister, is widely discredited because of this. And then you had our Thatcher, our Reagan, the Mulroney conservatives come in and try to get this straight, or they claim to anyway. Deficits keep growing. And then we finally get it right. We get the Liberals come in 1993, 95, and they're confronted, the story goes, they're confronted with this really big problem. 35 cents on every dollar is going to service the debt. We have a high debt to GDP ratio. The Wall Street Journal is selling us, if you guys don't get your house in order, you're going to be an honorary member of the third world. The Canadian dollar risks becoming a Mexican peso. It was a scary time. At least that was the frame. That's the framing of the story. And then there was this kind of heroic effort to turn things around. And by 97, 98, we're back to balance. And then Canada becomes the land of balanced budgets for the next 10, 12 years, right through the financial crisis. And after we quickly come back to that position, by 2015, we're back in balance and the world is good. So this is the story we tell ourselves. And at the heart of that story, I think, are these bond vigilantes, right? These people that are going to discipline a country like Canada, which is not the United States, doesn't have a reserve currency. This is the other part of the story. And we have to be careful because we're a small open economy with a floating exchange rate. And we have these constraints that maybe the US doesn't have. And that's the perspective from the more enlightened critiques of MMT, let's put it that way. So what do you think? What do you make of that story about the vigilante bondholders? And I'd ask you to maybe describe the relationship between MMT and that bondholding community. What does that you've been on the inside. What do they say when you talk to them about these things?
Well, it depends who you talk to. I was talking this morning to a friend of mine, Paul McCulley, who was the chief economist at PIMCO for a period of time. Now, PIMCO was the largest bond fund in the world, right? And if you ask Paul McCulley about this story, he will tell you, what so many of my friends who are in this space will tell you, that it was never real. Okay? You are not at the mercy of the investor class, or whatever you want to call it, right, of bond markets, when you are a sovereign currency issuing government. Now, I think that, the Canadian government did have some foreign denominated debt, and you probably were borrowing in dollars at the time. But look, when you are the currency issuing government, the most important thing to recognize is that you never have to borrow your own currency from anyone. Why would you, right? You literally have the legal authority, in our case, the sole legal authority the US government has to issue the currency. I can't do it, right? Private businesses can do it. State and local governments can't do it. If everybody else could do what the federal government could do, then the government wouldn't be doing, sending checks to people to try to help them out in the pandemic, and small business loans and all that kind of stuff to keep workers on payroll, money for state and local governments. They can't do what you can do. So you never have to borrow your own currency from anyone in order to spend it. That's a really important point. If you choose to offer people a way to hold their dollars, right, in a government security, an interest-bearing government bond, you can also choose the interest rate that you are willing to pay on that security. Now, that doesn't mean that the government always exercises that power. It might give markets some room to run, so to speak. And, during that same time period, we had Alan Greenspan. And Alan Greenspan went and famously, went to Bill Clinton and made a deal. And Greenspan said to Clinton, if you will back off of these middle-class tax cuts that you have promised, then we will work monetary policy in a more favorable way for you, and so forth. So, I mean, it's a complicated history. We are hearing, even today, here in the US, we're hearing stories like, well, don't you remember the morning that we woke up and Paul Volcker had raised interest rates 200 basis points? And that could happen again. So we better not do this next infrastructure package because markets might not like it. And so, we do tell these sorts of stories, but Canada has every bit as much capacity to manage its budget in a way that's like what the US or Japan or Australia or other sovereign currency issuing governments can do.
I want to pick up on that. You mentioned Japan, and that's a kind of classic kind of case study, I guess, of MMT. And they've had very substantial deficits for many, many years now, and their interest rates are at rock bottom. And as you know, there was famously for a long time what was referred to as the widow trade, right, where people would bet against Japan and they kept losing. So I'm kind of interested in digging down just a little more into the kind of investment community's interest in MMT, because it seems to me that's where a lot of these ideas first found a voice or a place for people that willing to listen. Why do you think that is? The very same people that were told to fear their decision making are the same ones who embraced MMT out the gate. So what's going on there? What do you think's going on there?
Well, first, I think that, because Warren Mosler, who, came with this set of ideas in the mid 1990s and, got these ideas in front of a small group of economists who then started to wrestle with his thinking. Well, Warren came from Wall Street. Warren was a bond trader. And so there's a level of respect, I think, among other traders when they know that the ideas can be traced back to someone who, lives in their world, comes from their world. And so there was less hesitancy to listen to the academics who were working with Warren Mosler and so forth. But the other piece of it, Marc-André, is they just want to get it right. And if they think that you have a better narrative, especially with respect to monetary operations, if they think that you understand the mechanics of the monetary system and the nature of government finance, and you can explain interest rates, and you can, the relationship between deficits and interest rates, or interest rates and inflation or something, and they think that they've got capital at risk. And if they bet wrong, and you mentioned the widowmaker trade, if you're walking around and in your head you have a belief that beyond some debt to GDP ratio, everything falls apart and the government's going to be forced into bankruptcy, it's going to end up like Greece, then yeah, you start shorting JGBs, and then you find out that it never happens. And so the widowmaker trade, a lot of people didn't survive that trade. That's why it's called the widowmaker trade. So my experience has been with people on Wall Street that they're open. They're open to hearing people who think differently, that don't want to lose money. And if you can persuade them that you have a better kind of framework from within which to analyze macro, they're totally open to it. One of the earliest kind of things that I did outside of academia with Wall Street Group was, I was in Kansas City and I got an invitation to come to New York City and have dinner at the 21 Club. And this invitation came from someone who knew Warren. And he said, you come and I want you to just talk MMT with us. We'll have dinner and we'll have some folks there. So to me, dinner and some folks meant, a round table with 6 people. And so I walk into the 21 Club in New York City, which is a very famous restaurant. And I go upstairs and they've got the private dining room. And there's a giant table, huge rectangular table. It had to hold 40 people. And I had no idea. I wasn't prepared, for that. And then I show up and everybody around the table is, JP Morgan and BNP Paribas and all that. And I sit down and they said, well, if you could just, talk for a couple of hours. And I thought, wait a minute, what? Right? No slides, no notes, no nothing. And I just stood up and did it. And then it became interactive. And then from that point on, many of those people just continued to, invite me to do things with their groups after. So because, they, on some level, I guess they were convinced and persuaded that there was merit in what they had heard.
So speaking of interactive, Stephanie, we got a whack of questions. I'm going to ask you one last question, and then I'll turn to the audience questions, if that's okay. So look, you've had a good reception in the finance community, increasingly amongst policymakers. But I'd like you to maybe think a bit about where this conversation is going. There's still a lot of people that I'd say are we say in the MMT community they're out of paradigm, right? They're still far from accepting a lot of what's in MMT. MMT is still far from dominating economic textbooks. And in fact, it's really hard to find a space for it in a lot of academics conversations. So can you kind of project forward? What do you see kind of playing out here in the conversation as MMT has kind of moved to the center of the broad public conversation?
I mean, textbooks are hard, right? There's a textbook author. There is an MMT textbook. I have it on the shelf behind me. I wouldn't call it an MMT textbook, but a macro textbook written by 3 MMT economists. So there is a lot of MMT in it. Textbooks are really tough, and that they managed to do that is kind of heroic in many respects, because there's another economist, David Colander. And David Colander has written textbooks and many editions over the years. And I think David has told this story over and over again, how difficult it is to get anything in a textbook that is a departure from what the mainstream is offering and teaching. And he says, at most, you can do 10% deviation. That's it. You can't go beyond 10%, or it won't get adopted. And so that makes it really hard, right? I mean, I never really liked to teach from textbooks. When I was teaching principles and intermediate, sometimes you feel compelled, but you can put together material without a textbook. But does it have to get into textbooks in order to go sort of next level? I don't know. It would be, I guess, helpful if we could start from scratch and try to lay everything out correctly from first principles, right? I don't know. What I do know is that I get lots and lots of email from students who are taking courses at Harvard or Michigan or wherever, Penn, and I get a lot of email, and they are discovering MMT on their own, and then they're bringing it into the classroom. And that is sometimes unwelcome, and, because they're in effect, they feel like they're challenging maybe a professor with a different framework and a different set of, a different approach. But I just think, there's, what's the old joke? Science makes progress one funeral at a time. The next crop of students, they're learning and they're questioning. And so I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think I might add, I think you mentioned earlier that there's kind of been an épanouissement of MMT beyond the economic space into history and law and other.
Yeah.
So there seems like there's some opportunity to kind of have this broader conversation based on some of these ideas. Okay, Stephanie, so I'm going to turn to one of our questions. I'm just going to take these sequentially, so no selection bias on my part here. If there's only time for one question, our interlocutor asks, this is what I want to know. What is the longevity of MMT? Most would agree that deficit spending is needed right now to stimulate the economy, but is it sustainable in the long run? And what is the MMT relationship with taxation? I guess that's two questions, but I think the first one's really kind of hitting at this inflation issue, and your recent New York Times editorial kind of touches on that. So maybe you can talk about that, the deficit spending and its kind of longevity. You kind of referred to it, but maybe elaborate.
Well, I wasn't sure what the it was in the question. Is it sustainable over time? If it meant MMT
Right.
or deficits, but let's assume it means deficits. So, in my adult life, no, in my entire lifetime, the government's budget in the US has been balanced or in surplus 4 years. 4 years. Not going to tell you how old I am, but that's a lot of years of sustained fiscal deficits. Deficits are the norm, right? There's nothing inherently problematic about a deficit. It just depends on the demand leakages. Like I said, you got these other buckets. Every dollar that is taxed away from me is a dollar that I don't have and can't spend chasing after some good or service in the economy. So this is tying into the other part of the question about taxes. So you got taxes are a leakage. Every dollar that I choose to save and don't spend is a dollar that can't be captured by some business trying to sell its output for, revenue and profits. And every dollar that I spend buying goods and services that are produced abroad rather than here domestically is a dollar that some US producer can't capture. So you've got demand leakages. And the question is always, what are the offsets? What are the injections that are helping to maintain the economy so that the output gets sold? So if business investment is robust, that's a strong injection. If government spending is strong, robust, that's a strong injection. If the rest of the world is buying goods from us and we have strong exports, that's a strong injection. In other words, the stronger the investment and the export channels are, demand, then the less need there is for government spending. So it's just about calibrating those flows. And it's like saying, will you need a deficit 5 years from now? I don't know. Tell me what the demand leakages are going to look like,
I mean, the story you've just told, I think templates really nicely on what happened with Canada in that late 90s period. We had a tremendous export boom, largely going to the United States. And that facilitated that budget moving into balance, right? I think that part of the story gets left out a lot. So I think that's a really important consideration.
The thing is, Marc-Andre, real quick, you had an export boom that facilitated the healthy bucket for the Canadian private sector. What we had was the beginning for a .com bubble, and then we had the beginning of a housing bubble. Right. And so we did not have, I'll say, the benefit, quote unquote, of the strong export channel. What we had was a real housing bubble that allowed the private sector for a period of time, households, to leverage up and drive a tremendous boom that on the surface, superficially, pushed the government budget into surplus. And it looked like it was producing a great economy, but of course it was all unsustainable because it was being driven by private sector deficits, and those aren't sustainable. Public sector deficits are.
And I think there's two points I'd make on that. One was the U.S. was in the world I was traveling, we were characterizing the U.S. as the buyer of last resort. They were buying up everything from all over the world, right, and generating that demand outside of the United States. But also in a Canadian context, that your point about the household sector really resonates, because we have a highly indebted household sector in Canada, a very leveraged housing sector. That is worrying a lot of people. And what concerns me is that if the policymakers start ratcheting back and moving towards a surplus dramatically, the consequences for that household sector could be significant, right? They're already pretty fragile. So I think we may be playing out the story that happened in the United States not too long ago. So we have another question here, and it's about the job guarantee idea. And maybe you can talk a bit about that. We didn't get into that, Stephanie, but it's an important element of MMT. Can you just expand on that idea of a job guarantee and the resistance that you see or don't see around that idea? That's basically the question that's being asked.
Yeah, I watched part of a webinar today with a number of people. The webinar was about a job guarantee, and they were all labor union leaders, and they were all championing the importance of a job guarantee from their perspective as labor leaders. Now, the idea goes back so far. You can find this in the work of Hyman Minsky, and I'm sure there are people listening in right now who are familiar with Minsky. I think he was one of the most important economists of the last century, and Minsky was writing about this in the early 1960s. And Minsky is someone who, right, he's an academic, he's an economist, but he's also, his area of expertise is in finance, financial markets, banking, right? And so Minsky had this idea that he said, okay, we have a lender of last resort. We have figured this out when it comes to the financial system. We went through panic after panic and depression and bank runs and all this kind of stuff. And we figured out that what we need is an institution whose job it is in part to quell, discord in financial markets, to deal with a lack of liquidity in financial markets, to act as a lender of last resort, to maintain liquidity at all times in the financial system. But he said, it's curious, we didn't invent anything, an analog on the fiscal side. So he said, why don't we have an employer of last resort? And we used to call it an ELR, or employer of last resort, many, many years ago. And we've sort of transitioned to calling it a federal job guarantee. But the principle is the same. And Minsky's point was, why don't we ensure that the labor market is always sufficiently liquid? And what that meant to him was that the government could establish, right, basically an open-ended job offer, a standing offer of employment, a public option in the labor market, and essentially create a perfectly elastic demand curve so that you've got the price fixed, and then you take everybody who comes and you create employment for them. You hire them, right, at that wage. And Minsky had a variety of, ways of defending the proposition, right, that you would have this liquid labor market that would act as a powerful new automatic stabilizer, so that when the economy goes into a natural downturn, instead of businesses shedding workers and they become unemployed, many of them long-term unemployed, and then many of them unemployable because skills deteriorate, right? Labor scarring, we're starting to hear today, right? Instead, they can transition into a new form of employment, stay employed, work habits are maintained, skills can be upgraded, and so forth. And they are ready as a pool of employed workers to be hired back into the private sector when the private sector is ready to restore jobs. And so it's a program that would cushion the economy through the business cycle. You hire in when the economy is weak, and you release workers from the program when the economy recovers. And you have the social and economic benefits, but the powerful automatic stabilizer is one that Minsky emphasizes well.
So that idea found its way, if I'm not mistaken, into the Green New Deal proposals, correct, Stephanie? And
oh yeah,
can you speak about that, the kind of political side of it? I mean, I know it's not your research area, but you've been engaged in that space. What is that story? What does that story look like? Is there an appetite for that? and politically in the United States or elsewhere that you're seeing?
Oh, there's a huge appetite. I mean, that's we have a Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley from Massachusetts, who just a month ago introduced a resolution calling for a federal job guarantee. And it is centered around this very idea that I just sketched out, but it is so much rooted for her in the civil rights movement, in the idea of equality and centering justice. And if you're talking about a Green New Deal, where, we're potentially talking about touching almost every part of the economy, transforming the way we live and work, it's housing, it's agriculture, it's energy, it's, transportation, then there has to be a just transition for people through this, years long transition off of fossil fuels. And so the idea of a job guarantee is very central to the Green New Deal for, or organizations behind the Green New Deal, for many lawmakers, because they see it as a way to ensure that whatever happens in these years that we're transitioning, that there is always the stability of, a good job, living wage with benefits through the process.
Right. So we have 48 new questions coming through.
Oh boy.
Stephanie, but we have till about 8:20 our time, which is, I realize, pretty late for you. So we'll hang in there, I hope. So here's the next question, Stephanie, and I kind of know where you're going to go with this, but I'll ask it anyway. What happens when the healthy economy cannot pay enough in taxes to make payments on the debt that have been incurred? I think there's an opportunity here to kind of reiterate some points you made earlier, but that's the question that's being asked right now.
Yeah, so again, the thing that we try to do in MMT is to get the sequencing right. So the conventional narrative goes like this, right? The taxpayer is at the center of the monetary universe. Everything revolves around the taxpayer. And as Margaret Thatcher told us, the government has no money of its own. There is only taxpayer money. So at the end of the day, we have to foot the bill for everything. And MMT says, no, there is public money, right? She's wrong about that. The government does have its own source of money. And if you get the sequencing right, you recognize that the government spends first, and only after it spends its currency into existence can the rest of us actually have it to either pay taxes or buy government bonds. So if we get the sequencing right, then we can see that by the time the bonds are sold, the spending has already happened. And so when we talk about, how do we pay back the debt? This, I think, it's very confusing because we're using terms that really don't apply to a currency issuer. The currency issuing government is not really borrowing. The currency issuing government is not really taking on debt, not in the sense that we borrow and that we take on debt, right? If I walk into a bank and I sit down with the loan officer, and it's Marc-Andre, and I show up and he's sitting at the desk and he says, "Can I help you?" I say, "I'm here to borrow money." He says, "Oh, how much money do we want? What do we want money for?" And I say, "Oh, here's my business plan," or, "Oh, I'm going to buy a home or a car or whatever." And he sizes me up and he decides whether I'm a reasonable credit risk, likely to repay the loan on time and so forth. He can make a loan to me, right? I walk out in debt. The government does not do that, okay? When the government borrows, let's do this. The government matches its deficit spending by selling bonds, right? So if the government spends $100 into the economy and only taxes 90 back out, we label that a deficit. We say the Canadian government deficit is -10. Now, you match your deficit by selling bonds, okay? So you put 100 in, you take 90 out, you've made a deposit. You got 10 Canadian dollars sitting there. But now you're matching the deficit up by selling bonds. So what happens is the $10 don't go in, the $10 in bonds go in. In other words, it's like me walking into Marc-Andre, setting the money down on his desk and then saying, "May I have a loan, please?" Right? I'm putting the cash down, and then it doesn't make any sense to refer to that as borrowing. And no future taxpayer will be harmed in the, retiring of government bonds. All we're talking about is shifting funds from one account at the central bank to another account at central bank, right? Paying down the debt means debiting the securities account and crediting the reserve account.
So I think
If that makes
that's a part where I think people get stuck. There's a that kind of detailed accounting exercise that you've run through in the MMT literature does a real nice job of. So I think that's a really important point, and it links to, I think, this conversation. The next question we have here is around the U.S. states, and I would say provinces as well, and maybe some subnational jurisdictions elsewhere are often restricted or prohibited from deficit spending, constitutionally or otherwise. So does this take, and I think this is, I know where you're going to go with this, but does this take an important tool out of the toolbox during a recession, or does it importantly ensure some level of fiscal discipline at that subnational level? And maybe I'll just add on, Stephanie, if you could talk about that relationship between the sovereign level and that subnational level, and what kind of policy should we see there, given sometimes these constitutional restrictions or other self-imposed limits on deficit spending?
Yeah, I mean, it works the way that it works here with respect to, our 50 states and territories. They do not have the ability to do what the federal government can do. Almost every state is subject to a balanced budget requirement. So what happens? In good times, you're okay, right? Because, you have strong growth, you have strong income growth, tax revenues are increasing, the economy is producing enough activity to buoy the receipts of the state government or the provincial government, and that's allowing them to maintain state services and operations and so forth. What happens is that economies don't just run in perpetuity in boom mode. Eventually, you hit a speed bump. I mean, you hit a bump and you go into recession. And when you go into recession, tax receipts tend to fall off a cliff. And depending on the depth of the recession, they might fall sharply off a cliff. And so then what, right? You don't have the ability to do what the currency issuing government can do, what the federal government can do. So you scramble. And we saw that here. We had state governors across the country. We had mayors imploring the federal government, please get us aid, please help us, because if you don't, there's only one option on the table for us. Now, technically they could try to raise taxes, but most of them don't want to do that. So they go slashing budgets. It's teachers who are laid off, right? It's essential workers who are losing jobs. Public services are being cut. The transit doesn't run as often, all that sort of stuff. So we've finally come around to this. And then the last COVID relief package here, we've got $350 billion going to state and local governments. But it is something the currency issuer can do. It can send that one-way cash dispensation, no strings attached. Whereas left to their own devices, they have really difficult, choices, budget cuts, or maybe some limited borrowing. But then you're talking about taking on debt in a weak state, and then potentially having difficulty paying it back.
There's lots of interesting permutations on this conversation, because there could be a case in a federation like Canada where you have provinces that are constrained, as you've described, and you have a central government that's not constrained in the same way. And there is this dynamic tension around who has what jurisdictional responsibility, how much should the provinces be on the hook for their own decisions, how much should they expect from the federal government in transfers. I mean, really meaty political economy questions that I don't think MMT purports to solve, right? There's these very real political debates that still play out in that space. And I don't know if you have any reflections on that. I mean, there is some solution, but there is also a jurisdictional tension here that I think persists, right?
Yeah, I mean, we have those. We've had those debates here as well. Lots of finger pointing, right? Because people say, well, if the government's just going to bail out the governors who've mismanaged their finances, or the pensions promise, overpromised with the pensions or something, and then we all start finger pointing. But the reality is that I think in our case, 6 or 7 of the 10 most needy states are red states, Republican states. So the reality is everybody needs the help, and they're going to get it.
Okay, so here's a question that's completely off. We're going to switch directions a little bit. It's about the 2008 crisis, and we saw a lot of mistakes coming from the banking sector, I guess, but the government felt obligated at that time to bail out the sector. What are your thoughts about that? I don't, this is maybe a little bit of a stray, but do you have any thoughts around that? And what's the MMT perspective on that bank bailout episode in the recent history?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I launched the blog, New Economic Perspectives, right, I think in the summer of 2009. So, Occupy Wall Street and some of those things started around 2011, but we wrote a lot during this period of time. Randy Ray wrote an awful lot about this during that period of time. We didn't like it. I mean, you're right to say, and I think that, politically now, lawmakers understand that it was a big mistake. The way that the financial crisis was handled or mishandled, as the case may be, and the total nurturing of Wall Street back to health at the expense, at the exclusion of doing what was needed to get Main Street back to health, right? That there was this belief that if you just rescue the banks and the financial system, that will rescue the whole of the economy. And that's just not the way it worked. We didn't keep people in their homes. Millions and millions of people lost their homes. I mean, we had a so-called recovery that was anything but a recovery for millions of people who never felt it, never experienced a recovery, while, pundits were saying, oh, the recovery is underway and so forth, and it just wasn't.
So that kind of speaks to this next question, Stephanie, because I think there's been some reflection within the Democratic Party that maybe they didn't manage that crisis as well as they could have and set up the conditions for Trump, for example, to kind of come in and take the ball. So here's the question, I think kind of relates to this point. It's dangerous for policymakers to cling to myths. What recommendations do you have for getting them, as well as the public, to kind of abandon the deficit myth, right? I mean, there's obviously your book, but maybe you can just speak to some of that changing conversation, how we do that. What's the way to make that happen in Canada, say, as opposed to the United States?
Well, listen, I don't know. I can tell you that it's happening here. I can tell you,
How so?
I'm on the phone every week with lawmakers who sometimes, just this week alone, my phone rings and I pick up the phone and it's a member of Congress that I've never spoken to before, who will say something along the lines of, I read your book. Everything, my thinking has completely shifted, and let's get together. Let's have you come present. So I'm doing all of that here. And it has gone so much further than I think almost anybody would believe, because I don't really talk about it publicly, but it's happening here. Now, how do we make it happen there? I understand there are maybe some lawmakers with us now. I just think it isn't easy, and this, right? Because so much of the time, what I've experienced is that lawmakers, even when they begin to change the way they're thinking, they don't know how to message it, because they have for too many years been out there repeating things like blowing a hole in the deficit, driving up the national debt, this inflammatory language that they've used. They've accused the people on the other side of the political aisle of, destroying the nation's finances. Look what you've done, you've wrecked. And now how are you supposed to then come in and embrace a more ambitious use of fiscal policy, including the use of deficits where appropriate to support the economy and to achieve, macro goals and social goals and so forth? It's tough if you've been out there, beating the other guy over the head for adding to the deficit, to then come out and find a way to reposition. But I can tell you, some of the most fun meetings I've had on the Hill with lawmakers have been about exactly this. How do we, now that we've pushed ourselves in a corner, how do we get out? And those are fun conversations, because you just start, everybody's going to have to take that leap at some point, and you might just have to say, we were wrong.
There's a kind of reputational inertia there that you have to overcome, right? That's really sticking. So I've got maybe 2 or 3 more questions, Stephanie, and thank you for your patience. This is
Sure.
really fun. Listen, this next question is going to take us again in a very different place. Didn't Keynes push for a world currency, the bankor, to stop the problem of having a national currency act as a world reserve standard? What is an MMT perspective on that issue of a global currency and Keynes's notion of a bankor?
Well, I think there's some sympathy for Keynes's notion. Now, it's not the same as a one world currency sort of thing, but doing something to reform the international monetary system in ways that, in a sense, level the playing field, especially for developing economies, because what you end up with so often are countries that get into a cycle, right, on a treadmill where they're trapped in developing country status. They never get an opportunity to develop because they're always, extracting resources for export, producing for export so that they can get the dollar, so they can turn around and hand the dollar over to the creditor because they've borrowed dollars because they need, medicines and food or energy or something, and they can't get, currency independent, current sovereign in that respect, but they also can't get independent with respect to essentials, right? Developing. So, I think that Randy and some of the legal scholars, Rowan Gray and Nathan Tankis and Scott Fulweiler and others, Fadel Kaboub, have been working along these lines of thinking about how to reimagine the international monetary system, the use of swap lines and that sort of thing. So there's some sympathy. I just don't think that most of us want to just grab the bankor and say, this is our plan. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, a promising area of research. How about we put it that way, right?
Yes, sure.
For anyone's interested. So here's the next question, and I'm anticipating your response, but here's how it's framed. I understand why deficits and debt don't matter in MMT theory. I know you're going to react to that. But if you take away the budget constraint for government leaders, what mechanism will force them to make the difficult choices about what to spend on? Or does MMT say they don't have to make a difficult decision as long as inflation stays low? So that's the question. Can you?
That's the difficult decision. First of all, what stops them? And you're right to say I'm the hair on the back of my neck goes up. Deficits and debt don't matter. They do. They just don't matter the way we've been taught to believe. And you're right to center the risk. The relevant risk is inflation. There's an inflation constraint. But look where we are today, right? Where we are today is lawmakers do not agree on an infrastructure package, and they likely won't agree. And so part of what stops them from pushing too far is just fundamental disagreements about priorities, what investments matter. Some want to put a very high premium on climate change and education and healthcare, and the other party wants to put a higher premium on, regulatory and tax and maybe some, skinny infrastructure, roads and bridges kind of thing. But, MMT is trying to say to lawmakers, look, when you put together legislation, you should have in mind that there is an inflation risk, and you should have to draw up your spending bill and have it vetted, rigorously evaluated, not to see whether it increases deficits over the next 10 years, which is what we do now, but to vet that proposed spending to see if you have properly, adequately mitigated any inflation risk that might be seen. And then you can just say to lawmakers, instead of coming back with a bad score from the Congressional Budget Office that says, no, this does too much to add to deficits, you would come back and say, actually, based on our analysis, you haven't mitigated the inflationary pressures of this sort of thing.
Yeah, so that's a really nice segue into this next question. I've skipped a few because you've already addressed some of these points that the questioners are asking, but it's around this C.D. Howe piece that I flagged early on in my comments. And it's interesting that piece actually makes a number of concessions to MMT. For example, they acknowledge that MMT says deficits matter, right? In the way you just described. They say that the governments have much more control over interest rates than we might commonly believe. They don't accept the crowding out story either. There's a lot of points that they kind of concede to MMT, but they still fall back on this fear of the bond vigilante at the end of the day. So I'm wondering if you can kind of reflect on that, because the question we have here is, what are your thoughts on the MMT or the C.D. Howe critique, which I've just kind of laid out a little bit in the context of a small open economy like Canada? That's the crux of it. Small open economy with Canada is vulnerable to these bond and currency traders who can drive our currency down, stop buying our bonds, drive up our yields, slow the economy, and create this concern around a debt spiral. So what are your thoughts around that argument? I'm sure you've heard variations on that theme before, so I'll throw that out at you.
Well, I just come back again. Sometimes I do joke that the last mile to MMT is the longest mile, because you can get, like you said, that they concede this point, they concede this point, they concede this point, and they get stuck where everyone gets stuck. And where everyone gets stuck is, but what if markets force rates higher? What if they don't? What if the appetite for our debt isn't there? To which I remind you that if we get the sequencing right, the spending comes first, the taxes and bonds come second, and borrowing in your own currency is never an imperative. Why would a country that issues its own currency ever need to get its own currency, borrow it from anyone? We don't have to borrow dollars from China. They can't turn off the spigot and no more dollars will come out. And then the US we tell ourselves this story, right? That if China ever wakes up one day and decides no more dollars for you, we're turning it off, that somehow we can't pay the bills. It's nonsense, right? It's nonsense. So you have to recognize that what you are doing as a government it's just the net spending. This thing we call the national debt is nothing more than a historical record, right? You're looking in the rearview mirror. It's a historical record of your nation's cumulative net spending. Every single year that the government made a financial deposit to the economy, put in more than they took out, you kept a record and you wrote it all down. And the number that you arrive at today is the look back. It's the historical cumulative net spending. They're the dollars that were spent in and not taxed back, currently being held in the form of government securities. That's a nice thing if you happen to have money that you can park in a government bond. It's a risk-free reward, right? Warren Mosler calls it a subsidy for people who already have money. It's like a universal bondholder income. But the government should never feel compelled to make a universal bondholder income available to anyone. And if you do choose to do so, remember that you can always manage the interest rate on those bonds. The Canadian Central Bank can always effectively take control of the yield curve. And even if rates go very high, like they did here when we had Paul Volcker under Reagan's presidency, rates were almost 16% on the 10-year Treasury, never fell below 7% Reagan's entire term in office. And what happened? He did 2 massive tax cuts, massively increased defense spending, tripled the national debt, and what? Yeah. And we made every interest payment on time and every, and it isn't about being, a small open economy. You don't have to issue the bonds if you don't want to.
Right. So interesting point about the debt as a kind of guaranteed income for rich people. It's also a deposit insurance, if you want to think of it that way. It's a bulletproof deposit insurance scheme for wealthy people as well. They no repayment risk, and you're kind of getting an interest payment along the way as well.
Frank Newman wrote a little book. He wrote a couple of books. I have them behind me. One of them is called 6 Myths That Hold America Back. Frank Newman was the deputy Treasury Secretary, Undersecretary of the U.S. Treasury, deputy. And Frank says, to your point, that the winners at a bond auction, the winners get the treasuries, and the losers, he calls them, are stuck holding their dollars in a bank account. Yes. Where they bear, bank risk.
Right. Right. Precisely. So Stephanie, this is literally the last question, although we have 75 in queue. I will, we've got to stop. So this is back to, it's the same theme, but let's go to a kind of more emerging economy perspective. And the question is where we're going to see capital accounts assume more of the country's deficit spending. If bonds are used to finance debt, I'm just going to read the question, and I haven't really interpreted, but how would swapping bond financing with taxation remedy previous debt assumed by these economies. So we're in an emerging economy context. What's the story there? Maybe that's another way of thinking about it. What's the MMT story in an emerging context, emerging economy context? So not Canada, not the United States.
Yeah, well, it depends. I mean, you have emerging economies that are issuing local, right, debt denominated in local currency. You got emerging economies that are borrowing in foreign currency. I mean, South Africa has taken on US dollar debt in the COVID, pandemic. So I'm not, the question's not entirely clear, but the risks are very different, right? It's not so much whether you're emerging or not emerging, but it definitely does make a big difference whether you are taking on dollar denominated debt. Many of these countries are much more vulnerable, sensitive to sharp swings in the exchange rate. And that mostly, again, goes back to if your exchange rate had a sudden, sharp depreciation, could you get medicine and technology and food and energy that you need?
Yeah. Listen, Stephanie, this has been a wonderful conversation. Very generous of you. I know you have a 6:30 a.m. meeting tomorrow, and it is 10:20 your time. I would be in bed by this time normally. So I'm very grateful. We're all very grateful for your time tonight. Thank you so much. I am now going to turn it over to, Parvin, who's going to kind of bring us to the conclusion of our conversation. Thank you again, Stephanie.
Thank you, Dr. Kelton, for your thoughtful and resourceful presentation, and Dr. Pigeon for facilitating such an interesting and engaging Q&A session. There are definitely many takeaways from these lessons of MMT for us to keep in mind to step past pandemic and leverage this potential. I think what stood out most for me at tonight's presentation was the comparison and drawing that line between the private sector deficits, which can be unsustainable, and avoiding the pitfall of taking the same approach towards the public sector deficits that can be leveraged fairly sustainably if the inflation risk is carefully evaluated and mitigated. Another interesting takeaway for me was also drawing the line for where to maintain liquidity to function as a cushion, for example, for the labor market or the transitions, as compared to the more conventional view of maintaining liquidity in all cases and as much possible at all costs. Thank you again for the amazing presentation and Q&A. I am now pleased to turn the floor over to Dr. Birdle, who will present the 2021 Mentor Award and close tonight's event.
Well, thank you very much, Parvin, and thank you again, Stephanie, for that amazing talk, and to all of our participants for the comments and questions in the chat. Please feel free to express your gratitude as well in the chat. It's just wonderful to have had such an amazing event. It is my great pleasure to present our Mentor Award tonight. Established in 2019 and awarded to one recipient annually, the Mentor Award recognizes and thanks outstanding public servants who have served as mentors in our executive internship program, contributed to the growth and development of our interns, and have made ongoing contributions to the school. This year, we are very pleased to recognize Nancy Gardner, Director of the Strategic Management Branch in the Public Service Commission, with the 2021 Mentor Award. Many of you here tonight may know Nancy Gardner through her long and winding career path with the Saskatchewan Public Service over the past 25 years. She has had roles with Energy and Mines, Saskatchewan Agriculture, and eventually came to the HR Service Center with the Public Service Commission in 2009 as Manager of Optimization and Reporting. It was during this time that she became interested in the wide world of policy, and through the JSGS Policy Certificate Program, decided she wanted to be a policy analyst when she grew up. Nancy landed in her current position as the Director of Strategic Management of the PSC, where she gets to combine her passion for all things planning with her expanding interest in policy, in this case, HR policy for government. It is the best part of her job is constantly learning from a staff of diverse policy professionals, all of whom are former or current JSGS interns. I will now let Rebecca Wallace, a past intern, and Sunday Lewis, Nancy's current intern, talk about why she is deserving of this award.
Nancy, congratulations on this award. It is so well deserved. You were and you still are an incredible mentor and friend. Our time together at the PSC set me up for success in ways I didn't even know at the time. For those of you who don't know Nancy, but let's be real, who doesn't know you, I want to share a few ways in which she shines. Nancy is a culture builder. She sees connections, she brings people together, and she helps them grow. Maybe by growing their waistlines, because there always seems to be food involved. Nancy is so invested in others' growth and learning opportunities. She invited us to countless meetings, committees, and encouraged us to participate as much as possible. Kind of like when she voluntold both me and Sunday to lead SMB's United Way campaign. Nancy has so much energy that it's contagious. Maybe it has something to do with knowing all the coffee hotspots in Regina and her endless runs to 33 1/3. Nancy is an incredible networker and connection maker. This is why going to JSGS events with you can be draining. She literally knows everyone. Nancy consistently recognizes others' hard work, and she's so supportive of her teams. It was really meaningful when she nominated our ED, Glenda, for a Chairs Award. So Nancy, thank you for everything and congratulations.
Yes, a very well deserved congratulations to you, Nancy, for the award. Thank you for being the awesome human that you are, a very kind and generous soul. You're so very open and welcoming that you made me so comfortable to relate with you from the very first Zoom call we had, and now probably 1 million Teams meetings together. You know, your style of leadership as a mentor is very enabling and empowering. I'm very grateful for that. Invitations to meetings at the leadership table, SMT, and even surprisingly at Chairs Forum, the PIN Forum, the interjurisdictional table, and many others, and the opportunity to lead various tasks in the branch have all provided great opportunities for my learning and development, contributing to my growth in many different ways. There are those times when I feel like I'm running out of ideas or that the challenge is too big, and I know I just need to talk to you and those ideas to start to flow again, because you're a source of inspiration and energy. You give planning a different perspective. You make it so attractive. And now I'm almost getting to become a planner. The chats during our coffee walks, the words of affirmation, the encouraging comments, and the moments of candor have all worked to prepare me for a future in the public service. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you for who you are and all you do, and you do it the best way you know how, and it is really great. With this, we say cheers to you, Nancy, and congratulations on your award.
Nancy, thank you for your support in developing the next generation of public servants and thought leaders. I'd now like to invite Nancy to unmute and say a few words.
Oh my goodness, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, well, that's who it's all about for me. It's about the Robertas and Sundays and Marias and Yings and Yulias and Jeffs and the others that I've had the privilege of working with. It really is a privilege to work with the high caliber students that Johnson Shoyama brings to us. It's easily one of the best parts of my job, but I'd like to share this recognition with my team. Mentorship at the PSC is a whole team affair, as well as a two-way street. We each bring a unique experience or style or skill set to share, and you don't have to ask us twice to share it. As our current intern Sunday would say, we have a few things to learn from them too. I appreciate when they throw down the challenge flag and question why certain things have to work a certain way. And I have to say, we don't always have good answers. So thank you to the amazing interns turned colleagues that continue to strive to make government more innovative, open, and accessible. It's been a true pleasure. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Nancy. And what I'd like to ask everyone who is on this call to do is, you all know where at this point where your mute buttons are. And if we were all together the way we should be in sort of a non-pandemic world, we would all be standing and applauding Nancy. I'm going to ask us to do the virtual equivalent of that. If you could please unmute your audio and give Nancy her very well-deserved round of applause.
Got a girl, Nancy.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you as well for those of you who are putting your congratulations to Nancy in the chat. It's very appreciated. I'd like to just say a few rounds of additional thank yous before I conclude this year's Tansley lecture. First, Dr. Kelton, thank you again for tonight's informative lecture. It was the time just flew, and I felt like we could have gone for another hour. But to everyone, especially you, getting up early in the morning, I can assure you we will not. To Marc-Andre, thank you so much for moderating the Q&A. It was there was so much going on in the chat. Your ability to manage all of that and have such a great discussion going has been it was really, really amazing. Parvin, I'd like to thank you for being such an amazing MC. For those of you who don't know, Parvin was also a member of our national case competition team this year. It placed third nationally, so congratulations to you and your teammates. Absolutely fantastic job. I would like to thank our JSGS staff who organized tonight's event. It's been a very large undertaking and exceptionally well done, as always. And finally, I would like to thank you, our guests, for joining us this evening, for your participation and engagement. It has been really, I think, a great show of what can be done when we have to make things work virtually. As always, for more information on our upcoming GSGS lectures or to learn more about our programs, please visit our website, schoolofpublicpolicy.sk.ca. Tonight's event was recorded and will be available for viewing once it's edited, so please be sure to let others know, and hopefully others can enjoy this wonderful event in the future. And with that, I will say thank you, good night, and stay safe. We look forward to seeing you again in the future. Bye for now.